All right, we're going to look at the book of Exodus. Tonight it is the second book of the Pentateuch. Pentateuch 5, first 5 books of the Bible, sometimes referred to as the Law. And so it's the second of those books. Kind of continues the story that we had from Genesis. And we'll talk about that some more in a minute. I remember Dr. Selhammer, he actually wrote a book called Pentateuch's Narrative, where he believes, and several others, but many scholars believe, that the Pentateuch really is, we call it 5 different books, but it's really one book. That it's one plot, one theory, one theme, and you can see together the big picture of these 5 books together better than you can take them individually and put them together. And although Dr. Selhammer used to talk about the fact you're just sailing along with this great story, right? It starts with creation, you got the fall, and you got the flood narratives, you got the city of Babylon, you got Abraham and all the patriarchs, and then you get the time in Egypt, and then you get the people being delivered out of Egypt, and you get the miracles of the sea being parted, and the man on the ground, and all these things going on, and then right in the middle of this narrative that's been pretty interesting to read is what? There's this huge bag of laws that's dropped in the middle. And when people start trying to read the Bible at the first of the year, and they start in Genesis and when you go to Revelation, the challenge is when you get the bag of laws, will you keep reading? And that bag of laws, we tend to think of Leviticus gets banged on the most for being the bag of laws, but it really starts in Exodus. And the bag of laws, the way it is really the covenant of how do we interact. And it's easy to argue that the key event in the Pentateuch, which leads to the key event really of the entire Old Testament Hebrew Bible in that period of time, is the covenant in Mount Sinai that we get in the book of Exodus, because that is that's the standard that all of the kings are going to be held to. Did they follow through with the covenant? Did they worship? There shall be no other gods before me. The first command of the covenant, or the 10 commandments of that part of the covenant, is the standard by which kings are judged. Did they follow God? If you're doing your daily Bible reading, we're talking about Asa today. Read about Asa today. And Asa was a really good king, and he tore down a bunch of stuff, but he didn't tear down all the poles. So again, it always reminds us in Chronicles that none of the kings meet up to what the Messiah is going to be, and his flaw was some of the high places. It was the high places, not the poles. It was the high places that he did not tear down. So other places we worship. But all that goes back to the covenant, and it's how God interacts with Israel. Are they faithful to the covenant? Are they not faithful to the covenant? So really the main thing, because we get the covenant with Noah, the world will be destroyed again. We get a covenant with Abraham about God's chosen people. And now we get the Sinai covenant, but that's the one that you go by. The one the covenant with Abraham, that's going to happen. Abraham's name's going to be great. He's going to have a land. He's going to have descendants. The Messiah is going to come from him. Those that curse his people will be cursed. That's all going to happen, and there's no conditions on it. This is what's going to happen. It's a different type of covenant. The Sinai covenant is conditional. Here is what I will do for you if you meet this. And if you want to worship me, and I am your God, and I'm the one that's called you out, and I'm the one that's delivered you from Egypt, this is how you will worship me. And so it really does shape everything that goes on in the remainder of the Pentateuch and in the remainder of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. By the way, just in case you wonder why I always say both, it's because they are not the same book. The order of the Hebrew Bible is not the same as the Old Testament, which bugs me. We should do our Old Testament in the same order as the Hebrew Bible, because we say it's the Hebrew Bible. We tell our kids it's the Hebrew Bible, but it is not the Hebrew Bible. It is in a different order. And there is some significant, I would argue, that there is some significance to the way the original Hebrew Bible was put in order that makes more sense than what we do in the English Bible. But nobody's going to restructure their Bible now, so that's a rant I go on that has no impact on anything. But that is why I'm actually pretty diligent about saying Hebrew Bible and Old Testament, both, because I do believe, be constantly reminded they are not exactly the same thing. Which I didn't know until I went to seminary. I've been in church my whole life, and nobody ever told me the Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible were not the same thing. I thought they were the same thing in the same order, and they're not. For instance, by the way, just to continue my rant for just a second, Proverbs 31 is about what? Virtuous woman, right? In the Hebrew Bible, the book after Proverbs is Ruth. So it's kind of interesting that Proverbs ends with the virtuous woman, and the next book in order is Ruth. And then Chronicles, which we're in the middle of if you're reading the Bible, we've got a long ways to go in the Old Testament, so we're barely halfway through. Chronicles is actually the last book of the Hebrew Bible, and that's why it starts at Adam, and it goes all the way through the kings in exile and back from being protected in exile, because basically Chronicles is designed to be a summary. Some people call it the first commentary. It's really a summary of what the entire Hebrew Bible is about. So that's the last book, and you're left at the end of Chronicles looking for the Messiah. And we'll talk more about that when we get to Chronicles. But anyway, all the Hebrew Bible / our Old Testament is this seminal moment, is the covenant of Mount Sinai, but then also the Exodus, because so much, Jesus dies during the week of Passover. The imagery of the Passover lamb, the image, how often does Paul talk about we were slaves to sin? Where does that whole deliverance idea of being slaves to sin come from? It comes from the idea that they were slaves, the chosen people were slaves in Israel. Why is it that the Israelites are supposed to be hospitable? You are to be hospitable to people from other lands because you were once slaves in Egypt. And so that whole concept of slaves of Egypt plays an integral part of what's going to happen in the people's instruction, how God expects them to live. So there's a lot of things in the book of Exodus that are extremely important and foundational to understanding the Pentateuch, to understanding the Hebrew Bible, to understanding all of the Bible. So it's an incredibly important book. Now,
why? Do you know the logic? Why they changed it? The order?
I like the way Dr. Silhammer said it. We basically went for the Dewey Decimal order. We wanted it to be all the history books together, then all the wisdom books together, and then all the prophet books together. I mean, that's how our Bible is set up. It's set up, you get all the stories, then you get the wisdom literature, and then you get all the prophets. And so when they decided to arrange it, whoever made that decision decided to arrange it more by category. If you're a kid, you'll remember, we used to have the picture up on the wall, and it had all the different categories so that you could learn what the groupings of the Bible were. Yeah, the little bookshelf, that's right. And where the Hebrew Bible actually is called the Tanakh. It refers to Torah. It was basically it's the Pentateuch, the writings, and the prophets. And so that's the three where we have multiple categories. The Hebrew Bible only has three. So it's just kind of interesting. It's just one of those you wonder why people do the stuff they do. But anyway, so I got no idea. All right, when you get to the key facts, we'll talk about these again. These come from towns and towns. The author is Moses. Again, he's the writer of the Pentateuch, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But anyway, 1445 is the date that we're going to go with. We'll talk about the significance of that in a few minutes. The recipients were the Israelites, and that is partially the Israelites that were with Moses just after Moses. If you remember, we get to Joshua. What was Joshua told to do? He was told to read God's Word, and that was the book that Moses had written because Moses is instructed to write it. So anyway, so the recipients were primarily the Israelites. Key word is Passover. Again, you can argue, and I would argue, Sinai is the most covenantally, that's the biggest event because that's where the relationship with God comes from. But the Passover is the picture of Christ. And we talked about that Sunday. Here's the Lamb of God. So Passover really is important. Exodus 3:14. So you'll see where from the time we talk about the Sinai covenant is important. Passover is very significant. It doesn't get on. And then there's the third thing that we learned in Exodus 3:14, which is listed as the key verse. God replies to Moses, "I am who I am." This is what you are to say to the Israelites. "I am has sent you." So we get the name of God. Up until that point, the name of God had been, the term Elohim was used, but now we get the name of God as I am, or the great I am, which also is going to play in when we're going through the Gospel of John. There are 7 times that Jesus says, I am the true vine, I am the resurrection, I am, there's 7 times that he says that. Then there's 7 other times in the Gospel of John where Jesus just says, I am. One of the times the Israelites, the Jewish leaders called onto it and they threatened to stone him because he said, before Abraham was, I am. Because they're like, well, you're not greater than our father Abraham. He's like, well, Abraham rejoiced to see me. And because before Abraham was, I am. And when he used that phrase, I am, they knew exactly what he meant. That was not unintentional. Jesus was basically claiming to be God. So the idea, by the way, some critical scholars argue that Jesus never says that he's God. They have never read the Gospel of John because he continually calls himself God. And you know that that's what he meant because of the reaction. So that name is significant. The other thing is the kind of the verb there of I am is, it's not just I am right now. And you can take I am as being present tense. I am, I am here, I'm at church tonight. But really the I am there is, the tense and the verb in Hebrew is eternal. That is, I exist. Is really the thought there because God has always existed. He existed before time began, he existed before creation. So he doesn't come into being, he just I am. And so the significance there is very important. So I think it's a good choice for the key verse, though it doesn't really, like I said, so there's 3 huge categories there in Exodus of events that we run into. Sinai covenant, Passover, and then the name of God being given to Moses. All right, now, I did want to address Moses being the author of Exodus because we're introduced to Moses in the book of Exodus. So the idea is not just in addition to being the author of Exodus, but also the entire Pentateuch. Now, one of the reasons that we believe Moses is the author of Exodus is that the story in Exodus completely intertwines with Genesis, and one of the ways that it intertwines with Genesis is it just picks up right where the story left off, right? Because in Genesis we end with all the 12 tribes, all the children have moved to Egypt, or just outside of Egypt, and they're down now in the Egypt area. And so what happens, the Pharaoh looks very favorably upon them while Joseph is alive, but then eventually relationships change over the course of time. The Israelites, because they're growing fast. I love the first chapter of Exodus. If you remember, it talks about the number of babies being born and how they they're just multiplying rapidly. And so they're having, so they're really growing explosion nationwide, wide, and that's why they wanted to enslave the Israelites. Was they're like, look, the way these people are having babies, they're going to outgrow us to be able to overpower us, so we want to make them slaves. And then the Hebrew wives, when they lied, in Exodus, also another interesting time when it was okay to lie, because it's a cover story, it's not a lie. But remember, they were told to kill the babies when they were born, and the male babies, and they're like, oh no, we couldn't get there in time. And as the Hebrew wives said, and they were rewarded because better to lie to the governor than it was, and the Pharaoh, than it was to actually kill the children. And so you got that right at the very beginning, so they grow rapidly. Exodus is the book where it tells us that Moses recorded some of the book's contents, and God said, write this down for those that would come after you. So that's in the book of Exodus. The rest of the Old Testament, when it refers to Exodus, will refer to, if it refers to it as the author, it will refer to it as the author is Moses. The New Testament will consistently call the Pentateuch Moses, or the writings of Moses. Jesus said, the writings of Moses. So the New Testament affirms that the first 5 books of the Bible are written by Moses. Extra biblical material, so material outside of the Bible, also points to Jesus being, or not to Jesus, it points to Moses being the author. So the Dead Sea Scrolls that were discovered in the 50s, I think. Anyway, the Dead Sea Scrolls and also the Babylonian Talmud, so there you get somebody even outside of Israel, indicate that Moses is the one that authorizes the book and our writer deliver the book. And so really, other than what happens is a thing called critical scholarship, and we talked a little bit about it last week, that there's different parts of, you can see where different people wrote different parts of the Pentateuch. Because what Moses would do, clearly he was not alive during Genesis, And so it's a good example. He would take other people's writings and use those and then stitch them together, inspired by the Holy Spirit. And so you can really go back through, and there's four major categories. And in those four categories, they're saying, see, there was at least 4 different authors. And so that's where critical scholarship, starting with the Germans, and then the Enlightenment period, started saying, well, no, there's other authors here. It's not just one because of the style writing and that type of thing. In fact, Daniel and I were talking about today, it's really interesting when you go back and map it out. When you look at the major scenes of where there's like the transition of maybe from Elohim to Jehovah, that's part of the transitions in the name of God. One of the words is J-E-P-D. Elohim is for the name of God in Genesis 1. Yahweh, name of God that we see here. And so different people categorize it, which is fine that you would have sources, and then you would write, because to be honest, that's what our gospel writers did. Our gospel writers took the oral tradition and then wrote it down. And not all the stories were exactly told the same way, but they were all telling their story to show why Jesus was who he was. So it shouldn't scare us that Moses uses. It doesn't mean it's not inerrant. It doesn't mean that God isn't the one that's behind the stories that he chose and the way he connected them together. Because it makes sense that that's what he would do in trying to put it together. So, anyway, nothing really other than the document hypothesis. There's no reason to doubt that Moses is the author of Exodus, and by extension, the remainder of the Pentateuch, or the law. Now, the other interesting thing that comes up in the book of Exodus is, when was the Exodus? So the Exodus is named after what?
Departure.
The departure, right. So it is the Exodus from the Egyptians. So again, the book's even named after that departure. So the question is, when, if we go back and look at the timeline, when did this happen? What years did this happen? And there's really 2 dominant theories for when this happened. One is called the early date, or the early Exodus, and that's 1446, 1445, and that's going to be the period of the Exodus, and that's also the date that they've got where the book starts being written. So you can tell which way Heinsohn and Townsley lean. That they're going to lean towards the early theory. Now, if it's early Exodus, then the pharaohs are Thutmose III and Amenhotep II. And they would have been the Thutmose III, the pharaoh. He's the one that would have really been the one that, where it says, didn't know Joseph and therefore oppressed the people. That's going to be him. And then Amenhotep II is the guy that was the pharaoh at the time of the Exodus. And that's leaning towards, now where do we get those dates? How did they come up with 1446? Well, one thing you do is, if you go to 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1, it says that the Exodus occurred 400 years prior to Solomon's 4th year. Now, don't you love that? It's not when Solomon began to reign. It's his 4th year. I think it's because it's talking about when the temple was built. Anyway, so it's going to reference something for the 4th year of Solomon. But in that verse, it says the Exodus occurred 480 years. So if we can narrow down, go in the other direction when Solomon reigned, then we go back to 480 years before that. All right, Japheth claimed, now this is the book of Judges. Japheth claimed Israel occupied Canaan, land of Canaan, for 300 years. So you get that period of time that the Israelites are wandering for 40 years, and then when you do the period of time that they were there for 300 years, ruling over Canaan, based on the book of Judges and going through and how they map out all the years, right, with the genealogies, and that's going to put it, again, that would put you at the same period of time, the 1446 BC. There's a book called the Maripatha Stele. I have no idea how to pronounce it, I'll be honest. That's why I type it out, so that somebody didn't have to go, hey, what is that? That was written in 1220 BC, and basically refers to Israel, and not just to Israel existing, but that it's already an established nation, which means it's probably been around a couple hundred years, which again leans towards the 1400 date. The Amarna tablets, written in 1400 BC, interesting enough, are written by Canaanites, and they basically refer to this as a period of chaos. Now, why is that? Because when you write the history, you don't get details about how you lose wars and how you lost the land, so you just say this is a period of chaos. And so that would most mirror when the Israelites were most likely conquering the land. So there again, that was written in 1400, so if you've got the conquest, that would make sense that it would be going on in about that period, 1446, when they started to move in. Especially when you factor in the 40 years of wilderness in there. All right, and then the dream still of Tuthmose IV, who followed Amenhotep II, so that's the guy that was ruler. So note, this is what it says about him ruling. And again, this is outside the Bible. It indicates, so this book of history by the Egyptians, right, because it's named after an Egyptian, he followed in, record the history of that part of the world, says that this guy, Tuthmose IV, comes into being. He was not the first legal heir to the throne, because the eldest son, who would have been the legal heir to the throne, had died.
Passover most likely. wasn't
Yes, so it's so that eldest son dying lines up with the idea that the Pharaoh's son died. And so those all point to 1446. Now, there are those that argue for a late date, 1290 BC. And so a couple hundred years, about 150 years later. Now, if the Exodus, when the Israelites left, was 1290 BC, then Ramses the first and Seti the first, they would have been the pharaohs. That would have been the ones known for oppressing the Egyptians, and Ramses the second would have been the would have been the pharaoh when the Exodus happens. Now, one of the greatest movies of all time is the Ten Commandments. Don't ever trust it for biblical stuff, because Moses is a stutterer, and Charlton Heston played Moses. If there is anybody that you would see as a picture for the opposite of Moses, it's Charlton Heston. So it's a great movie. As a movie, it is lousy. But the problem is it shapes a lot of our what we believe about the Exodus, because if you're like me, it was on every Easter. That's one of the things you watched we always watched the Ten Commandments when it came on. So I've seen that movie probably a dozen times. But and who is Pharaoh in the Ten Commandments? Ramses. So clearly they're leaning towards the 1290 version, because Ramses is the one that they say is the Pharaoh. So interesting that Hollywood takes the early time.
Yul Brynner.
Yeah,
Yul Brynner, yeah.
They played his medicinal studies. All of it.
Another great actor. Yeah, that movie was loaded with actors. He's awesome too. And then Bo Derek's husband was Joshua.
Let's say he played Bud Ben-Hur and he did Moses.
Who's that? Oh, no, he's great in whatever he does. You're not going to hear me say anything named about Charlton Heston as an actor. He even playing in the Apes. Anyway. Ramses won the study with the depression. Ramses. So naturally, a lot of people believe that Ramses was the guy. So that's where they would have gotten the name Ramses instead of Amenhotep. Plus, let's be honest, if I'm going to make a movie, I want Ramses better than Amenhotep. To try to say. Anyway.
Closes off the tongue better.
That's no doubt. At least the English tongues. So now the biblical date, so that's the biblical date. The 480 years that we talk about is more like saying decades, or it's supposed to be generations, because 480 years would be 12 generations. And so the idea is that when in 1 Kings it says 480 years, it's really talking about 12 generations, and so it's not talking about specific years. And then the same thing for the 300 years that we talked about before on the second step of Japheth, that he was just generally. And remember, the judges judged in different places, and so the argument would be that some of these judges were judging at the same time because they were in different parts of Israel, and so there was overlap, and it wasn't a full 300 years, it was a condensed period of time. So that's the argument on the date that way. There's no extra biblical references to Israel if you go outside the Bible. Prior to that book we talked about in 1220, so the one group uses the 1220 to say, well, no, Israel's always established, so it had to be established earlier. The other side argues, well, if you don't see Israel till 1220, that means they must not have existed till then. And so both sides really use that same book for 1220 BC to argue their point. Here's the part, though, that really started this as a discussion. and that is the archaeological evidence. There's really nothing in the archaeological evidence from the 15th century to denote that there was a conquest of by the Israelites of the Canaan territory. Now the problem with that is, you never know what the next archaeological discovery is going to be. So to base anything date-wise, plus you're still using carbon dating, which is not science, it's an estimation. And we can go into all that. It goes into the same thing for trying to age the earth and that type of thing. There's a lot of subjectivity and there's some objectivity, but there's mostly subjectivity in how they calculate some of these dates. And so relying on archaeological evidence can be a challenge. Now the Israelites also, there are some challenges to their early date. The Israelite city helped build the cities of Pithom and Ramses. Exodus 1:11 talks about building the city of Ramses, and we see that he's not the Pharaoh until later. So they could have started those cities, the name could have changed later. But anyway, they weren't, and those cities weren't complete until the time of Ramses the second, so they were later on after the Exodus. And again, the idea of overlapping judgeships could account for tabulating a shorter period of time. The biggest problem with the late theory is that it disregards the biblical chronology, which seems to be laid out more orderly, in favor of inconclusive archaeological evidence, because most of the people that argue with that build their argument begin with archaeological evidence instead of biblical evidence. So that's why most conservative scholarship is going to go with 1446. So that gives you kind of an idea of what period we're talking about in history for that. Okay.
Does some of this have to be, some of the dispute that had to be because Ramses, he found his son in one of the pyramids?
Yeah, the dating of that kind of stuff that comes up. But again, so for years, so one reason you don't want a couple other stories of why you don't want to argue about, or you want to rely on archaeological evidence for years. Critical scholars, for decades, critical scholars argue that David was really a legend and a myth more than he was an actual king, because there were no extra material, biblical material ever talked about David. Again, when I tell a history, I tell the history that's most favorable to me. And so I don't talk about losing to David. And so, Solomon has a lot more, but David was the one that they would question. Well, archaeologically, they ended up finding a bunch of knives that had DVD on them. And again, Hebrew alphabet doesn't use vowels. So DVD is who? David. And it was customary for people to write the name of their king on their weapons. And so now all of a sudden we have knives, multiple knives, that have David written on them, which tells you that David was what? Likely a king. That's why anytime you rely on archaeological, in the story of Jericho, one of the critical scholars point out, well, if you say every word of the Bible is right, why is it that blind Bartimaeus, one time they're walking into Jericho, and one time they're walking out of Jericho, right? Because it's very difficult for me to walk into South Boston and out of South Boston at the same time, right? However, they did archaeological research. They found archaeologically that basically Jericho was being rebuilt at that time, the time of Jesus. And there was, by the way, a lot of, the time of Jesus had a lot of renovation, a lot of build. In fact, Jesus, a lot of people say he's a builder. Construction more than, the word for construction worker is the same as carpenter. And so a lot of people believe it was probably more construction than actually was like carpentry, the way we think of carpentry. Because Capernaum, where in Nazareth in that area, had a lot of building going on. So same thing here. They had this building going on with Jericho, and both were called Jericho at the same time. So it would be very easy for me to walk out of Old Jericho into New Jericho, or out of New Jericho into Old Jericho, and be that way. So again, archaeological evidence came across later that verified that the story made sense. So always difficult to rely. You never want archaeological evidence to be your primary evidence. Okay, when we get into the text of Exodus, it's really, we'll look at this in a second, but one of the best ways to think of the book of Exodus is how it happens chronology-wise, is 3 periods of 40 years. Because Moses lived 120 years, and there are definitive differences between his 0 to 40, 40 to 80, and 80 to 120. And so Moses, we see the story, he's raised in the house of Pharaoh. It was at 40 years old that Moses decided it was time for him to deliver. Moses actually believed he was to deliver the Hebrews. And he was going to start doing that, and if you remember, he actually killed a Roman soldier. And the next day, what? Egyptian soldier, sorry. And so that happens. And then the next day he's talking to the Israelites, and they reject his leadership. He goes, what are you going to do, kill me like you did that Egyptian? And so he leaves and goes away for how long? 40 years. And then it's after a period of 40 years that God comes to him in the burning bush. And so it's from that burning bush, from that calling forward, is the last 40 years of Moses' life. So one way to think about the divisions of Exodus is by that. The way they're going to look at it, the way they put together, I think it's a reasonable way to put together. It is the first part, which is the story, and then the second half, which is more dealing with the covenant. So again, like where the bag of laws are. So that story part that we kind of sail along from Genesis, you see redemption, then you see the liberation, they get away, and then you see the preservation because God preserves them in the wilderness. And so God redeems them to save through the Passover. There's the liberation, they get out, and then there is the preservation after that. So then you get to the second half, and God gives his instruction to a redeemed nation. So again, he offers the covenant in verse 19. It's really interesting when you read that. Again, stories that are fascinating when you go back and read them, subtle things that you see. Is initially, God said, I want y'all to come to the foot of the mountain. Don't come any further than this, but all of Israel is supposed to hear. And when God first speaks the Ten Commandments, first speaks to the Israelites, they hear his voice and tell Moses, no, you go talk to him because we're scared of him. And as you see them reject God and the way God said to approach him and doing some of those things, then all of a sudden there's more laws. It's just really interesting to watch how the laws compound and that covenant complicates the more rebellious the Israelites are in that. So anyway, so you get the offer of the covenant text, so basically what the covenant is, chapters 20 through 23, which include the Ten Commandments, and then covenant ratification ceremony. So that's when they actually go back, because the first time Moses comes down from the mountain, they're fooling around with the idols, and so you don't get the ceremony until later, chapter 24. And then you finally get the instructions from the tabernacle. So the last 15 chapters are preparing the tabernacle of worship, of what the tabernacle is going to look like. So the covenant at Mount Sinai is how do you worship God? God's going to give them physical pictures. And we see that for the tabernacle. The tabernacle we know is what? A picture of, or would later be the temple, but is also primarily a picture of what? Heaven. Because Jesus was sacrificed not in the temple made by man, but in the temple in the heavens not made by the hands of man. So that tabernacle gives a picture of what heaven looks like. Outer court, inner court, and then the Holy of Holies where God himself resides. So there's a lot of picture and imagery there that again covers all the way through the rest of the Bible. When you talk about the Ten Commandments, really there's two categories within the Ten Commandments. The first part is our responsibility to God. No other gods. Speaks to polytheism. There's not a multiple God. There is one God. Do not make an idol. Speaks against idolatry. Don't place anything ahead of God. Do not misuse the name of God. Talks about, profanity. Make sure you don't use God's name in vain. And then remember the Sabbath is against secularism, right? We don't make sure that we separate ourselves from God. We're separated from worship. We're not part of man's society. And then the last part of the commands are the responsibility to people. Honor our father and our mother. And it really is that is really, a lot of people talk about that really being a transition command. Because though it's dealing with the human side, mother and father, it's also the first commandment, the promise, honor your mother and father, you'll live a long life. But it's also that transition of respect for authority. And so a lot of people kind of think that transition is the last five are really more about responsibilities to the people, the last group, responsibilities to people. So again, do not murder, which again is not to hate people. But we know from the way Jesus interpreted it, that murder specifically, do not commit adultery, do not steal is against theft, adultery is against adultery, no false testimony against lying, and then do not covet against materialism. Now, The other interesting thing about how the Ten Commandments are written in English in Exodus, because that's the order we've all learned, right? Know the gods before me, don't make any graven images, don't do not use the Lord's name in vain, or the Sabbath day, keep it holy, honor your mother and father, murder adults, do not steal, do not bear false testimony, do not covet. In the Hebrew, it's not quite that clean. And if you go back and read the English versions of Deuteronomy, it's not always that clean. Because you get extra commentary, it's not just those words, there's other words with it in there. And where that dividing line is, some would argue that it's really the first three and the last seven. And that the do not covet is actually broken into two groups, that that's two separate commands. Do not covet your neighbor's wife, do not covet his property, and that those should actually be separated. When you read the repeat, well, that doesn't have anything to do with that. All right. When you read the repeat of that in Deuteronomy, again, there is, it looks like the break might be someplace different. So it's just kind of interesting. When we talk about in English, how it's said as the 10, and it is referred to as the Decalogue, is referred to as 10 Commandments, but the numbering, there's some question about the numbering and how that's actually supposed to happen. Fee and Stewart talk about three key narratives that we need to make sure we understand to help guide our thinking as we read the stories in Exodus. One is God's miraculous deliverance of his people, right? So we just need to understand that, because that, again, pictured in the New Testament, we're delivering from the bondage of sin. For God's miraculous deliverance of his people, we're delivered miraculously from the bondage of sin. They were delivered miraculously from the Egyptians. The return of God's presence, the Israelites had gotten away from his presence, and so they right, because they kept wanting to go back to the land of Egypt. But we see God coming back. He's distinguishing his people from the other people of the world because they are his chosen people. And then the gift of the law, and the establishment of the covenant. So everything has to be viewed in how that covenant put together, how it impacts everything as we read in the book of Exodus. A couple of theological issues. This is our book, Curley and Phillips put together. They have two good summaries. They have a New Testament book and Old Testament book, how you just book by book. And so we'll look at some stuff that they point out each time. And so when they talk about the key theological issues, there's the theocracy, which is the idea of a nation led by God. And that in our world really doesn't exist. The only example, in fact, the only example you really have of theocracy in our world is Iran, where the religious leaders are also the political leaders. And so that's really the only place that exists. And so so we can carry a bad connotation to it. The idea is this idea that they are God. God is their Lord. He is their, they are a nation under God. And so the idea of theocracy is also an important theological issue because they are God. What did Samuel? Why did they fuss? What Samuel fussed when they said they wanted a king? God is your king. You don't need a king. God is your king. So anyway, so the idea of theocracy. What is the name of God? Again, so when you look at it in Hebrew, the transliteration is YHWH, which is why you hear the word Yahweh, because you have to put the vowels there. The other interesting thing is the Jews wouldn't say it. So the letters that are written in the Hebrew Bible are Yahweh, YHWH. So that's where we get Yahweh from, put the vowels on it the way we would pronounce it. Now, it's often called Jehovah, right? And there's no J, there's no, so the reason that comes about, again, there's no vowels, but the other part of that is that English is Germanic in its origin, and so there's no Y, or there's no J, there's confusion over the J because there is no Y. In the original language, and then the same thing with one V instead of the double V. The double V is actually a double Y, and so we say W. It's actually, so there's a U and a W in our language. There's a V and a double V in their language, and that double V is what's used there. And so that's why we don't know if it's Jehovah or Yahweh, but most likely it's actually Yahweh, although a lot of people say Jehovah because of the origins of English. Then the other interesting question is, are the Ten Commandments for Christians today? Now, our first reaction is yes. Our first reaction is that the Ten Commandments are for today. However, in the New Testament, 9 of the Ten Commandments are confirmed. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. It's actually the only commandment in the New Testament that is not affirmed in the New Testament. Do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not bear false witness, no other gods before me. All the other ones you want to list are affirmed by statements or by writings in the New Testament, except honor to remember the Sabbath day. And the interesting thing is, as we go through the Gospel of John, is how many times we see a battle over what is the Sabbath about. And Jesus would say, the Sabbath was made for man, man was not made for the Sabbath. So, are we under the Ten Commandments? The other argument against that, just to ponder, is, am I bound by the law, or am I free in the liberty and the grace of Christ? Am I free in the grace of Christ, or am I bound by the law? If I'm not sure about that explanation, then read the book of Galatians. Because Galatians is all about beating up on a church that was so tied to carrying out the law that they didn't live in the freedom and grace of Jesus Christ. So, there is no question that the morals, do not lie, honor your mother, father, there is no question the morality of all of those that we should live under that. All right? In fact, Jesus took it another step. He said, don't just commit adultery. To commit adultery in your mind is to commit the sin. In fact, do not murder. In fact, it's not just do not murder, it's do not hate. So, because that's where the murder is going to come from. So, are we bound by the law, or under the headship of Christ, is there actually even a higher standard that deals with how we look at things? So it's an interesting thing to contemplate. And so again, our initial reaction is always yes. But when you think about it, it is actually something interesting to consider. Okay, just a fun question. Elmertown, at the end of the towns and Hines, and ask some questions, and I'm writing those down at the end in case I have time left over. I can ask. They're just some fun questions to think about. So I'll ask you one of those. How does the Passover preconfigure Jesus Christ's death for us? How does the Passover preconfigure Christ's death for us?
Blood.
Blood, all right. What else? That's right, blood's right. That's not the only thing.
When Jesus comes again, we'll go quickly, but signifying them having to eat quickly, I don't know.
Okay, we'll do that.
Talking about the lady, but what about the son, when the firstborns were died?
Mhm.
Christ is the son, Jesus is only begotten son.
Okay, so the symbolism of the oldest son.
Yeah,
However, the oldest sons here died because they weren't obedient. See,
yeah.
be a little careful with that analogy. But I can see what you're saying. What else?
Sheep.
Sheep, the Lamb of God, right? The reference we talked about. What else?
Okay.
That we are spared and given life. I mean, that's it, right? We're deserving of death. Everybody's deserving of death, but if there's blood on the lintel and the doorpost, you are given life and provided life. Life, you know, those babies, they didn't do anything to earn it, right? But it was passed over because of the grace of God. So anyway, so it is, you really can't miss the path. I mean, it's, again, big significant stuff going on in the book of Exodus that the rest of the Bible uses for imagery, the covenant, the name of God. Again, very significant, the Gospel of John, and the life of Jesus. So a lot of stuff in the book of Exodus when you read through, you kind of hang on to. All right, let's pray, and we'll be dismissed. Dear God, we again come before you to praise you, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. Thank you for the book of Exodus. Thank you for what it teaches us about you. Thank you that you sent Jesus to be the Passover lamb. Thank you that you give us life when we deserve death. Thank you that you will return. Thank you that we will be changed in a moment when you return. So God, we just thank you for that. We thank you that we can learn about that. And Lord, just help us when we read the book of Exodus to remember all the promises that you made, all the promises that you kept, and Lord, that we will worship you the way that you desire to be worshipped. In the name of Jesus Christ we pray. Amen.